Good morning. Welcome to our time in God's Word together in the Unfolding the Word series. We've been in the midst of a study of the book of Daniel, and of late we've been in chapter 5 of Daniel. Chapter 5 of Daniel relates to us an event at the very end of the reign of King Belshazzar, who was the final king of the Babylonian Empire. In a time of prideful drunkenness and ridicule of God, he holds a feast for his major leaders and ridicules God in the midst of that. And God then sends a message. And the message took the form of the finger of God writing on the wall. That message scared the king to death, essentially, as well as his nobles. And after finding the Magi unable to answer what that was about and what the message was, he reluctantly ends up calling Daniel after the advice of the Queen Mother. Daniel comes, and after rebuking the king, gives the interpretation of the king. And as you remember, the finger of God that was writing these words on the wall had written down, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. The word Mene was the Aramaic word for numbered. He would have understood what the word was, just didn't understand what it meant. So by repeating it, God was saying clearly, the time has arrived, the time is up. Your days are numbered, the kingdom is numbered. It's ending. Tekel is the Aramaic word for weighed. They would have understood that, but not understood again what it meant. In this case, God says, I've weighed the kingdom. I've weighed the works of the kingdom. I've weighed it in the scales, and it's found lacking. Parsin is the Aramaic word for divided. And indirectly, the word was used to describe the Medo-Persian Empire, which was really a divided empire, a conglomeration of two different countries or two different groups of people, the Medes and the Persians. At any rate, the message of it was your kingdom is now done. It's divided against itself. It is finished. Judgment has fallen. Now today, in these final couple verses, we see the outcome of this event in the life of King Belshazzar, as well as the life of the Neo-Chaldean Babylonian Empire. Let's look at them together. 4 things I want to point out to you as we conclude our study. The first is this. Notice that Daniel, who said, I don't want any of your rewards, I don't want the robe, the purple robe, the golden chain, the honor of being third in command of the country, of the empire. Daniel said, I don't want any of these things. And yet, after interpreting this handwriting on the wall, the finger of God on the wall, the king gives him all of that stuff anyway. He gets something he didn't request and didn't really want. Sometimes that happens in life, by the way. You don't want something. You don't request it, but sometimes it's given to you anyway. And I think in those cases, many times, the right thing to do is just graciously accept it. That's the implication here that Daniel did. He didn't say, I don't want it, after it had been given to him. He said, I didn't want it at first. In other words, I'm not going to give you the interpretation of what's happening on the wall here on the basis of you giving me something. But nonetheless, after all was said and done, it's like he graciously accepted it. Good strategy, perhaps, for all of us when we encounter those times where something's been offered to us that we didn't ask for or necessarily even want. Be gracious about it and accept it. Well, that's a very minor point here, but I wanted to make it. The second thing I want to point out to you, though, as this chapter comes to a close, is that very night, the Medo-Persian Empire, the armies of the Medes and the Persians working together, defeated Babylon. Notice it's that very night, the night of all of the crisis of this 5th chapter. Now, we know a lot from outside the scriptures about what happened that night. The secular historical records of the day are uniform in letting us know what was happening, what Cyrus, the emperor of the Medo-Persian Empire's strategy was all about. And here was his strategy. What he began to do sometime before this final night was he began to work to be able to divert the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River flowed under the walls of Babylon. this huge, massive capital city that Nebuchadnezzar so many years before had built. Think about it as building dams. What happens when you build dams is that you create a way of temporarily diverting the flow of a river. That bed dries up, you build the dam, and then you let the river go back into the normal channels after all. That's really what was going on here. It was a tremendous feat of engineering, if you think about it. In fact, it's identified that way by secular historians. And in a sense, it was a new strategy. There's no other records of similar thing being done where a river was dammed up as part of a strategy of war. Well, what happened? They, on that night, that very night, notice that's the terminology using, on that very night was the time where they were opening the diversionary channel. And the Euphrates River goes into that diversionary channel. And as it does, the level of the river drops in Babylon and eventually drops down to next to nothing. The holes in the walls of Babylon that had allowed the river to come in and then go out the other side now open up, and it's clear that you can get through them. There's not anything blocking you, whereas the river had been blocking you before. And as that opens up, as those holes open up, unexpectedly, by the way, to the Babylonian army and the guards on the wall, they didn't know what was going on. But as it opens up in a prearranged plan, the Medo-Persian armies send in their initial stormtroopers in a way, and they enter in the city, and then from inside the city, where it wasn't defended, the defenses were on the walls going out, they ended up defeating the armies, defeating the city, and destroying the empire in its final capital city. Historical records tell us that in that destruction, that defeat of Babylon, that Belshazzar, that final king of Babylon, was killed. Historical records also tell us that along with the king, the majority of his lords, the ones who were formerly ruling different parts of the empire, were also killed. It was a bloodbath. But an interesting thing is added to the story here in the book of Daniel. An insight from history that historians don't have, but God has seen fit to give us. And what was that? There was one ruler who didn't die, who wasn't killed in the bloodbath. Who was that ruler? Daniel. You see, remember, Daniel had been clothed in the purple robe, gold chain, made third in command. God protected now this third in command of the empire from the fate that awaited Belshazzar and all of his lords. He had given and had worked in the hearts of the Medo-Persian leaders to have a respectful attitude about Daniel. We're going to go back to that when we start the sixth chapter, Lord willing, tomorrow. I want to talk a little bit more about that. But at any rate, despite the fact that he had been currently, for the last several decades, marginalized in his power after Nebuchadnezzar's death, some of the leaders still knew him out of the Medo-Persian Empire. And God gave them a good attitude toward him, so he was not killed along with the other leaders. All right, there's the second thing. The third thing is that Darius the Mede takes over rule of the province of Babylon. Cyrus, the emperor of the Medo-Persian Empire, is now the empire controlled all of these regions, had broken the empire into 20 different provinces. And each of these provinces had a governor over it. Darius, a Mede, was the one that Cyrus, the emperor, set over the province of Babylon, which was that capital city and some of the region surrounding it. And he now ruled that region under the oversight of Cyrus, who was the emperor of the entire empire. And therefore we see that the chest and arms of silver have completely replaced the head of gold in the chapter 2 dream, which unfolded for us the picture of God's plan of history. One last thing. As we end the 5th chapter, let's remember that while Belshazzar was killed on that very night as a disciplinary hand of God. Death wasn't the end of Belshazzar, or anyone else for that matter. You see, Belshazzar, who had already therefore lived and died in the midst of the fulfillment of the mene, mene, tekel, parson message from God, the finger of God writing it on the wall, now, as I was talking to you about yesterday, had to face his own personal mene, mene, tekel, parson. The end of his worldly kingdom, in the end of that empire, the Chaldean Empire, the Babylonian Empire, pales in significance with the eternal loss that he now faced before the God who is really there. Just as Hebrews 9:27 says, just as is it appointed for man to die once and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. He died and then still consciously facing judgment before God. His own mene, mene, tekel, parson. All people face it who have not passed from judgment into life by faith in the gospel. Well, join me tomorrow as we begin a new chapter, chapter 6, which introduces us to this early stage of the Medo-Persian Empire and some dealings between Daniel and Darius, the one who was given charge of the Babylon region. God bless.